Here, why we were concerned.
Okay, let's keep talking about this interview. One of the FBI agents in the interview said on election day to another FBI agent, "You should know that I'm with her." Now, her was Clinton, right?
Correct.
How you feel about that?
Very concerned.
Okay, eventually very concerned gets to be enough already. I'm very concerned. You know, I'm glad I don't text an email. That's one thing I'm glad I don't do. But have you ever proved a case by circumstantial evidence, Director Wray?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to write you a letter and talk about why you should reconsider your findings as to whether or not it affected the investigation. Here's what Miss Page said on March the 4th, 2016. God, Trump is a loathsome human. How you feel about that? I mean, she's entitled to her opinion.
I think we've laid out here why we were so concerned about it.
Well, when you add it all up, as early as March, these people hated Trump, and this investigation was anything but by the book. And at the end of the day, what Comey did just blows me away as much as it does y'all. And I can't believe that this happened to my FBI. I told you the story, Mr. Wray, Director Wray, about wanting to be part of the organization, and y'all were smart enough not to take me. The bottom line is, if you're on our side of the aisle, this really does hit you hard. And we can't just write it off. I think there was a lot of bias that did affect an investigation that is, to me, almost impossible to explain using any standard that I grew up with as a prosecutor or even as a defense attorney. This is struck to Page on October the 20th. Trump is an effing idiot. The bottom line is, I'm glad you found what you found, Mr. Horowitz. I'm not buying that the Clinton email investigation was on the up and up. And the reason I'm not buying it is because the two people intimately involved, one, the guy, the lead investigator, clearly did not want to see Donald Trump become president of the United States. Finally, do you agree with me that finding her liable criminally would be inconsistent with stopping Donald Trump? If they found Hillary Clinton was criminally liable, that paves the way for Donald Trump. Can you put those two things together?
I guess it would depend when, but yes, I could
How about
see
July,
conceivably
a week
it could.
before the convention?
Oh, it clearly could conceivably.
Well, not only clearly conceivably, that's exactly what's happening here, folks. You cannot hold her criminally liable and stop him. As to the law, why did they change gross negligence in the original statement, Director Wray, to reckless disregard?
I think I would defer to the Inspector General who looked into that.
Why did they do that?
The explanation was that.
Can I just suggest something?
Yeah.
Gross negligent is a criminally liable standard.
Correct.
So if they had said it the way they originally wrote it, she's guilty of a crime, and the reason they changed it is because she's not guilty of a crime, and if you want to stop him, it can't be gross negligence. What's the difference between reckless disregard and gross negligence?
Not much.
It's a lot
pretty much-
politically.
Right.
Thank you.
Senator Coons would be next, so I guess we'll go with Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I can't let this afternoon pass, Director Wray, without saying to you how grateful we should all be for the men and women who work for you, who put their lives on the line, whose integrity and dedication to our nation are in no way affected by anything in this report. And I still have on my wall my seal from the Department of Justice of decades ago when I was United States Attorney, and I know that the men and women of the FBI work hard every day to uphold those ideals, and I want to thank you for your response, which is to make the FBI even better and avoid any repetition of a small number of agents and attorneys casting a cloud on the integrity of the FBI. So thank you for your response so far.
Thank you, Senator.
Director Horowitz, if I were President Trump and I held up this document to you and I said, sitting here right now, this report totally exonerates me. It shows no collusion, no obstruction of justice. What would you say to me?
Senator, I'd answer as I did before, which is the report covers the mid-year investigation. It touches on the Russia investigation in connection with the Wiener laptop matter, and that's what this was concerning.
And I want to thank you for the work on this report, and I respect your basically avoiding my question. I know that you're playing by norms and rules that apply to the Department of Justice, but you're dealing with the President of the United States that has no respect for those norms and rules. And he is distorting this report. He is weaponizing it to discredit the special counsel and to really undermine the rule of law in the United States of America. And he's using your report to do it. So I would just respectfully suggest that all of us have a responsibility to state the truth and speak that truth to power, which in this case happens to be one of the most powerful men on earth, when he lies about it, because it gravely threatens the rule of law. And I know you're playing by the rules, but he isn't. Let me ask you, Director Wray, the effect of these leaks from the New York office to Rudolph Giuliani was the subject of a letter that I wrote to you on May 8th. I don't know whether you have seen it or have it in mind. Basically, it asks you what is being done to assure there are no continuing unauthorized disclosures to Rudolph Giuliani, who now, just to state the elephant in the room, is the president's lawyer. Can you assure the American people that there are no ongoing leaks from any office of the FBI to Rudolph Giuliani?
Well, Senator, I'm certainly not aware of any. We are aggressively investigating a number of leaks, even as we speak. As I mentioned earlier, we have a dedicated unit that I stood up to focus on that. We have a new media policy that makes the rules unmistakably clear to everyone in every office. We have a disciplinary arm that is well regarded as being one of the toughest but fairest out there, and we intend to use all those things to make sure that everybody in every office follows the rules regarding leaks.
Well, if you would, I would appreciate a response to the letter, we have received none yet, that provides some more specific assurance that there are no ongoing leaks, because these leaks had a very practical effect. And we state the timeline in the letter. Rudolph Giuliani said on October 26, 2016, that he expected a surprise in the next few days. 2 days later, Director Comey issued his letter, and he did it in large part, and I'm quoting his general counsel, because they felt it would leak, those emails would leak if he didn't write the letter. And then Rudolph Giuliani said, when asked about whether or not he knew about the letter, "You're darned right, I did." So the practical effect on Director Comey's decision to do that letter was very, very tangible. I want to go to another impact of the leaks and ask you about them. We now know that Mr. Giuliani was not the only recipient of leaks designed to hurt Hillary Clinton. Representative Nunes recently admitted that FBI personnel secretly informed him in September of 2016 when Clinton emails were found on Anthony Weiner's laptop. He's admitted that fact. And they did it just days after the emails were discovered. So there was a leak to him. The timing and context of this disclosure strongly suggests that the goal was, in fact, of this FBI leaker, to give an outspoken Trump ally politically sensitive and highly secret information to use for political purposes. Representative Nunes appears to have recognized this fact because he never told any of his Democratic colleagues on the Intelligence Committee about it. Can you assure us that there are no ongoing leaks or unauthorized disclosure to Representative Nunes or anyone else in the House Intelligence Committee?
Well, Senator, again, I'm not, as I said before, I'm not aware of any ongoing leaks to any member of Congress or to the media.
And you would
I find
take
all,
action?
I would absolutely, if I was aware of a leak, I would take appropriate action. I don't want to cast aspersions on the New York field office, which I think is one of our best offices. But I don't condone leaks anywhere to anyone, and I don't really care what the motivation is, no matter how altruistic it might be. Leaks are wrong, and we need to be tough on them.
And I want to join you in the respect that I share for the New York field office and, as I stated earlier, for the FBI. Generally, General Horowitz, the comments that we have all said are unacceptable and abhorrent from Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were not the only inappropriate texts. In fact, there were comments that were disparaging about Hillary Clinton, were there not, that you found in your report?
We have put in there other examples of texts, including other individuals beyond.
In fact, there were slurs by FBI agents against Hillary Clinton, one saying, for example, that urged colleagues in the FBI to continue investigating Clinton to, quote, get that, I'm not going to articulate the word here, but there were slurs against her from other FBI agents.
I think that recounts what the general counsel said he had heard, so I don't think that's from these text messages.
It's not a
just to be
direct
clear.
quote, but it is something that was heard.
That was something the general counsel FBI general counsel relayed to us.
Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to go first to you, Mr. Horowitz. A lot of discussion has gone on back and forth here about whether bias has been found and what that bias was. You have indicated that your report has not found documentary or oral testimony or evidence showing bias in the charging decisions. Is that correct? How would you put it?
Yes. So as to the charging decisions, that's correct because they were made by the prosecutors, not the individuals, obviously, who were the agents whose texts we were concerned about. And in addition, as to the specific investigative decisions we looked at, we also made clear we didn't look at all the decisions in the report. And I'll add, when we got to October, we had concerns that there may be bias impacting the decision to prioritize the Russia investigation
So
over.
what you're
the
talking
investigation.
about is what prosecutors did with
Correct.
the report. You're not talking about whether there was bias in the recommendation not to prosecute, are you?
Correct.
And you're not saying you didn't find bias. For example, in the emails we've been having a lot of discussion about here.
I think it's clear from certainly the text messages we've talked about with regard to Mr. Strzok that he had, as we say here, a biased state of mind.
And as I understand from reading the report, not only Mr. Strzok, but a number of those who you found concerning comments being made by expressed remorse, said that they intended for these to be private conversations, and then said that it didn't have anything to do with the way that they did their job. Is that correct?
That was their explanations.
And what you're telling us is that you don't have any different evidence than that. You're not saying you believe it or not. You're saying that you don't have different evidence.
Correct.
I think that's a lot different than saying there's no bias, personally. Secondly, you did say, I believe, somewhere in the report that with regard to the charging decision, since that decision was made not by those who you found the bias from, but by others, and this would be prosecutors, not FBI agents, correct?
Correct.
That you felt that whatever bias they had, at least as to the charging decision, did not flow through. Even though, can you say that that's true, even though in this case, the director of the FBI gave a charging recommendation?
Yeah, I would,
Well, that leak unit, as you alluded to, sometimes leaks are criminal and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just awful but not criminal. And so one of the ways in which leaks can be most clearly a concern under the criminal laws is in the context of classified information. And so that leak unit that I'm talking about is really targeted very specifically on anything that has to do with leaks of classified information, you know, mishandling, et cetera.
Well, I appreciate that. I would recommend to you that you may want to have a leak investigation unit for non-classified leaks because there are serious problems when those happen as well. With the time I've got left, I think I'd like to change topics once more and go back to the meeting between Hillary Clinton and between Bill Clinton and Loretta Lynch on the tarmac in Phoenix. And Mr. Horowitz, you indicated, once again, I think your language was that, well, you indicated that the meeting was not an accidental meeting, but unplanned.
Correct.
Is that correct?
correct.
How do you know it was unplanned?
Based on the records we reviewed, at least from the Attorney General side,
Yes.
is what we were speaking to. We didn't see any evidence, as you would expect to see through the Attorney General's details, security, et cetera, that was about to occur. I obviously don't have authority or access over other records, I rely on what we were told by the witnesses.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. It's sort of the same thing with regard to the witnesses who you identified who had bias. They said, well, we didn't really express that bias. And what you're saying here, isn't it, is that you haven't got the evidence as to whether it was planned or not.
We have, what I would say is from the Attorney General side of it, based on the reactions of the staff, how it played out, it appeared to us that they didn't have any reason to think there was a plan for a meeting.
Well, some of us think it's quite coincidental, if you will, that the Attorney General and the former president would both end up in the same place on the tarmac in Phoenix. My time is run. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just just to explain that a little, there is a, as you know, discussion in here, and I encourage folks to look at that and see how that meeting played out, particularly with the staff.
All right.
Thank you. Director Wray, would you agree that there is that this report has no bearing on whether the FBI is capable of conducting its role in the Mueller investigation?
I don't think this report speaks to the special counsel investigation.
Thank you. And then General Horowitz, this past December, 6 months before the IG, your report was released, the Justice Department invited a group of reporters in to view the text messages that have been discussed here from the two FBI agents. And I'm concerned, I think many of us are concerned about what seems to be a selective disclosure of parts of the report. At that time. It is clear that at that time, at least the investigation had not been completed, and therefore the disclosure of parts of the report were without the public having the full context of the findings of the report. Do you believe that to be, that press conference holding it when it was held, to be atypical of the department's practices as it relates to revealing information to the public?
Frankly, I don't have all the details of how that occurred. I know, in fact, it did occur. We made clear we were not consulted beforehand. I will say on the question of whether they're appropriate to send them to Congress or not is something I did testify to and speak to, because I think that's a different question.
That's right. And
Director Ray said, there's legitimate oversight.
Right. My question is about the press conference that was held.
Right.
And do you believe it to be consistent with the department's general practice, the Department of Justice?
You know, I'd have to talk with folks there. I'm not sure I'm in a position to give an opinion without understanding more as to what their rationale was for why they did that. We have not investigated or looked.
Will you open an investigation into the cause and the reasons for that press conference? And also an investigation into who called for that press conference and what those reasons were?
Senator, I believe there might be Privacy Act litigation going on. I'm not sure. I'd want to look at that. As you know, we don't step into the middle of active matters. So let me look at that and be happy to speak with you further and your staff further about it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And is there anything in this report to suggest that the FBI is incapable or unable or incapable of conducting current or future investigations in a fair and impartial manner?
No, not at all. We speak to this report, to this matter.
And is there anything in your report to suggest that Special Counsel Mueller is not able to partner with the FBI to conduct his investigation in a fair and impartial manner? I
would just echo what Director Ray said. This report covers the Clinton email review.
Thank you. And on June 5th, 2018, the president tweeted, quote, "Why is it taking so long for the Inspector General's report on Crooked Hillary and Slippery James Comey?" In that same tweet, he implied he knew about the substance of the report and stated, quote, "There are so many horrible things to tell, the public has a right to know." On June 14th, the report was released to the public. When was the report completed?
The report's completed when we release it. Just
the same day that it was released?
The day we, as per usual practice, the day before the report is released publicly, we provide it to the department and, in this case, the FBI.
Did you provide it to the White House?
We do not do that.
Did you direct that it should or should not be
We don't
with the White House?
direct the department. The department has to make that conclusion. The FBI has to make that conclusion. Every report is different and stands on its own, and we've had instances, as I could testify to, in terms of, for example, Fast and Furious. There was disclosures to the White House about it for various reasons. That can be there can be a basis to do it. I think it's something you'd have to direct to the department for an answer.
And was the report completed then? I think you've said this, but I'd like clarification. Was your report completed, or was there any draft disclosed to any agency outside of your IG's office before or on June 5th of 2018?
So with following, again, our normal practice, as we do in every report, and as we did in this report, we provide a draft copy of it to the department, and again, in this case, the FBI, to review, and this was in mid-May, to review and to provide us with what we call a a review to determine whether there's, for example, grand jury, Title III, other information in it, classified information that would be inappropriate to be public. In fact, in this case, there was, and at our request, the department went to court and got unsealing orders so that what you see here is unredacted and full.
When you shared that information in May, did it include your findings?
It includes our full draft, and to the question asked earlier, did anybody pressure us to make changes that softened, weakened, changed the findings? We were not pressured in any way to do that.
Were
We
you
followed our
requested?
usual practice.
Were you requested to change the findings in any?
We are asked routinely by people that are commented in here and others to
Let's talk
rethink.
about this case, if you don't mind.
I am
Were you-
talking about this
yeah.
case. We allow individuals as well to look at this.
Did anyone in the White House ask you to change?
We had no communications at all with the White House.
Okay. And then Director Wray, you've talked, many of us have talked about the duties and responsibilities and ethics of a prosecutor. I appreciate that you are enjoying not being a practicing lawyer anymore. But I'd like to ask you, the report aptly notes that, quote, criticizing individuals for conduct that does not warrant prosecution is something that the department simply does not do. As a former prosecutor, as a citizen, as the director of the FBI, do you agree that when Director Comey concluded that Secretary Clinton's conduct did not amount to a prosecutable offense, that he should have refrained from making any public critique or commentary?
Well, Senator, as I said earlier, I think the policies the department has governing commenting publicly about uncharged conduct are there for a good reason. In addition to having been a prosecutor, a line prosecutor, the head of the criminal division, I've also been a defense attorney, so I've also had clients that are impacted by those policies and norms, and I think those policies and norms are there for a reason, and I would expect to follow them.
Great. And I appreciate the point you made earlier about the new policies that you put in place, and I join the comments made by many of my colleagues in praising and thanking the men and women of your agency for the work that they do. And much of that work has happened with local law enforcement in California, and on behalf of them, I thank you for that.
Thank you.
You also mentioned and the report mentions a number of recommendations. So, Director Wray, I'm just going to ask you for the record, if you'll commit to, one, enforcing the policy that prohibits the department and its employees from publicly discussing the conduct of uncharged individuals.
Yes, that's part of our remedial action in response to this.
And will you also commit to enforcing the Department of Justice policy that explicitly prohibits the department and its employees from taking investigative steps that could impact an election?
Well, I think we would follow department policy on that, and I would expect our folks to. My understanding from the Inspector General's report is that there may be room for the department to be a little more clear about exactly what that policy is. Mm-hmm. There is a pretty long-standing norm that applies to it, but whether the policies themselves are clear enough, I think, is up to debate, and I think we would work with the department and follow whatever the policy is.
Thank you, and then if you could follow up with the committee, that would be great. Thank you, nothing else.
Senator Kennedy.
General, couple of brief questions first. Can we agree that the FBI is the premier law enforcement agency in the history of ever?
I will say one of them, since I oversee multiple law enforcement.
Can we agree that the FBI has about 37,000 employees?
Yes.
Can we agree that there were and perhaps still are a small minority of bad apples at the FBI?
I think in any large organization, you're going to find problems.
Can we agree that Director Wray has the will, ability, and authority to find those bad apples and terminate their employment with extreme prejudice?
Yes, and we work closely with Director Wray and have a very good relationship.
And refer them for prosecution if necessary?
That's correct, or to the IG for investigation.
Can we agree that Mr. Comey, while he was FBI director, was intentionally subordinate?
Yes.
Can we agree that insubordination, particularly intentional insubordination, it can be a symptom of managerial bias?
It could be.
Did you find that Mr. Comey was unbiased or biased and did not act on his bias?
We found no evidence that he was politically biased. That was what we were looking at and asked to look at in the requests we got.
Can we agree that bias is a state of mind?
Yes.
Can we agree that the only person who truly knows that person's state of mind is that person unless he's insane?
Yes, or memorializes it or tells somebody about it in some way.
Did you find any indication that Mr. Comey was or is insane?
No, we did not.
Okay. Are you referring Mr. Comey for prosecution?
There is no referral here as to him. And
Could a U.S. attorney who might have jurisdiction decide to prosecute?
the department as a whole can look at this report and take whatever action it deems appropriate.
Okay, if an FBI agent lies to the FBI, that's insubordination too, isn't it?
It's a clear violation of rules, and I think you could characterize it as insubordinate for failing to follow the rules.
Like Mr. McCabe?
I'm going to refrain from speaking about that and let our report speak for itself.
Okay, well, so Mr. McCabe, who is insubordinate, gets referred for prosecution, but Mr. Comey, who is insubordinate, doesn't get referred, but he gets to keep his pension and his book deals. Is that about the deal?
Well, I'll just add, well before we finish this report, Mr. Comey had been terminated and so was no longer at the FBI.
Right, but he could still be prosecuted.
In theory, yes.
Okay. I want to read you some of the emails and text messages that came out of your report. These were all emails, instant messages, and text messages by senior members of the FBI. They were involved in the Clinton email investigation, the Russian investigation, the Mueller investigation, and in some cases, all three. 8/16/2015, Peter Strzok, quote, Bernie Sanders is an idiot like Trump. 2/12/2016, Lisa Page, I'm no prude, but I'm really appalled by this, so you don't go looking in case you haven't heard. Trump called him the P word. The man has no dignity or class. He simply cannot be president. 2/12/16, Peter Strzok, oh, Trump's abysmal. I keep hoping the charade will end and people will just dump him. The problem then is Rubio will likely lose to Cruz. 3/3/16, Lisa Page, God, Trump is a loathsome human. 3/3/16, Peter Strzok, oh my God, Trump is an idiot. 3/3/16, Lisa Page, also, did you hear Trump made a comment about the size of his, I'm not going to use the word, it rhymes with wang doodle, the size of his D earlier? This man cannot be president. Day after the election, 11/9/2016, FBI employee, quote, all the people who were initially voting for her would not and were not swayed by any decision the FBI put out. Trump supporters are all poor to middle class, uneducated, lazy pieces of S that think he will magically grant them jobs for doing nothing. They probably didn't watch the debates, aren't fully educated on his policies, and are stupidly wrapped up in his unmerited enthusiasm. 11/8/2016, you think by FBI Agent 1, you think HRC is going to win, right? You think we should get some nails and boards in case she doesn't? Same day, FBI Agent 5, she better win, otherwise I'm going to be walking around with both of my guns. Day after the election, 11/9/2016, FBI Attorney 2, I am numb. FBI Attorney 2 later, same day, I am so stressed about what I could have done differently. Last one. Day after the election, FBI Attorney 2, I just can't imagine the systematic disassembly of the progress we have made over the last 8 years. The Affordable Care Act is gone. Who knows if the rhetoric about deporting people, walls, and crap is true. Honestly feel like there's going to be a lot more gun issues, too. General, do you believe in the tooth fairy?
Nope.
Do you believe in the Easter Bunny?
Nope.
Do you believe that Jimmy Hoffa died of natural causes?
Not based on what I've read.
Do you honestly believe that the American people are going to look at this report and look at those emails and not believe that there was bias and people acting on bias and that the fix was in at the FBI?
I completely understand the concern, Senator, and that's why we've laid all this out here, and that's why we found that it impacts the credibility of the handling of the investigation. And what we say here is not, as Senator Crapo mentioned, which is that there was no bias, but rather what we were asked to look at was whether the specific decisions we reviewed were affected by bias. And those particular decisions here that we're talking about were decisions made mostly by the prosecutors, not by any of the individuals you just indicated there, and where there was that concern, which was in October, where Agent Strzok was in fact a decision maker. It's precisely why we found the concern we found.
Let me stop you, because if I go now, I can get in one more question.
Go ahead.
Your classified index.
Yes.
Does it contain or discuss an email that refers to a conversation allegedly between Attorney General Lynch and a person by the name of Amanda Renteria?
I'm not sure what I can say about that publicly, given the matter's classified. So I would ask you if I can get back to you on that. I'm hesitant to say anything in the public forum about that.
Would you allow our chairman and our ranking member to see the classified index?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, what we are trying to do, Senator, is what ended up happening is because of the nature of the information in there, it was classified at such a high level by the intelligence community. We don't make that decision by the intelligence community, that it limited even the members who can see it, as well as the staffs. And what we're doing right now is, and I asked the Deputy Attorney General's office to help facilitate this, is to go back to the intelligence community and let us know how we can address whatever caused this to be classified at that high level, so that we can make sure that we can write it at a level and get it to the members, including as to the question you raise, promptly. And they told us they are doing that. We very much want the committee to see this information.
Yours was a very professional report. Don't agree with all the conclusions, but I want to thank you for that.
I appreciate it.
Thank you,
Mr. Senator. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Director Ray. Thank you for sticking up for your organization. And Inspector General Horowitz, thank you for the thoroughness with which you discharged your duties here. I want to go back to something that's been touched on here because I really want to hammer it home. There are prosecutors and investigators all over this country who look up to you, who looked up to Director Comey, and who take a lesson from what they see. When I heard Director Comey extemporize derogatory investigative information about an uncharged person, I was stunned. Director Comey, you've said that the rules against that are there for a reason. Just to make it perfectly clear, could I ask each of you to say, what is the reason that we do not want prosecutors to be discharging derogatory information about uncharged persons?
Senator, my understanding has always been that the purpose behind those rules and norms is that prosecutors speak through charging documents, and that the reason for that is because then the individuals who are charged have an opportunity to have their day in court and defend themselves, whereas public statements about uncharged conduct don't afford that opportunity.
They could move over the line into smearing as opposed into proper judicial conduct, proper investigative and prosecutorial conduct.
They could.
And in fact, even where there is a charged person, do you not disclose derogatory investigative information only through pleadings and arguments, and you would not approve of a press conference just adding in some derogatory investigative information outside of the proper channels of the prosecution.
In the charged context, we try very hard to make sure that our public statements stay within the four corners of the
actual
charging documents until the case has reached a conclusion, and then maybe we'd be talking about the evidence at trial or something like that.
Mr. Horowitz?
In fact, as you know, as having been a U.S. attorney, what was interesting as we went and did this review is there is a department rule that makes clear that the department can't speak publicly about an unindicted co-conspirator. In other words, an individual about whom the department has concluded is in fact a co-conspirator in a criminal enterprise, but wasn't charged.
And there's a
but it
reason.
doesn't have a rule about an individual who's never charged. And that's why we make the recommendation.
But instead it has that norm, and that norm was what
Correct.
Director Comey violated. I don't believe that if he had not violated that norm, he would have ever been up testifying in Congress. It is bizarre to have the director of the FBI testifying in Congress about a case, particularly one that may continue. And I don't think if he'd stuck to the rules, there would have been anything for Congress to look into. He just would have said, we don't discuss cases, we don't discuss investigative information, we worked hard, we made the finding that we made, and that's the end of it. And if he hadn't had all that conversation up in Congress, I don't think he would have felt the same way about the Wiener laptop information, and that second disclosure of derogatory investigative information would not have taken place. So for want of a nail, all of this unraveled, I think, to the great detriment of Director Comey's reputation, which had been very good, and to the reputation of the FBI, I'm sorry to say. And I thank you for your efforts to have to put this back together, Director Wray. If political advantage to President Trump, then candidate Trump, was not Director Comey's motivation in making those statements, and if it's corollary, political damage to Secretary Clinton was not Director Comey's motive in making that statement on July 5th, what was, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, what we describe here is his explanation being that he thought there needed to be unusual transparency given the unusual nature of the case, the high profile of the case, and his belief that the integrity of the FBI and the Justice Department depended on being able to stand out there and explain what the decision was, why the decision was made, and that he was uniquely situated to be able to do that.
Did you find that credible?
That he believed that, yes.
That he was right about
That he was right about that, no, as we lay out here. That's the responsibility of the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General. The highest ranking, whether it's the U.S. Attorney, the highest ranking prosecutor has to make that decision. Under our system, they're the ones who are accountable to the public, to this committee, to the organization.
Did you come across any evidence that would refute the notion that he was concerned about his own reputation and wanted to look balanced in going about this rather than following the rules?
We got a variety of testimony, to be fair, on that. That was in various places as to why he did what he did, the integrity of the FBI and the organization, and really a series of explanations from individuals as to what they believed.
Director Wray, a general question. When should criminal investigations be wrapped up?
It's hard to answer that in a general way. I think when the work is done, is the most shorthanded way of putting it.
How often is legislative opinion about when a criminal investigation should be wrapped up a proper factor to consider in wrapping up the investigation?
It's hard for me to think of a situation where that's a factor we would consider.
I can't think of one either. I agree with you. How often is a subject's lawyer's opinion on when an investigation should be wrapped up a proper factor to determine the wrapping up of a criminal investigation?
That one's even harder for me to imagine.
Yeah. And in fact, I suspect it would be pretty hard for United States Attorney Giuliani to imagine when he was going after Anthony Salerno for years if Anthony Salerno's lawyers had said to him, it's been a year, time to wrap it up. I just wanted to put that context out there. Finally, with respect to obstruction of justice, which you've said is something that should be taken extremely serious at the federal level, official acts can be evidence of obstruction of justice, correct?
Well, I think that's a legal question that I'll leave to the lawyers.
Would you stop an obstruction of justice investigation if it involved a official act, or would you continue to investigate? That's no bar to proceeding on an obstruction of justice claim, is it? Because the obstruction was also an official act?
Well, again, I'd have to look at the law on the subject, but my impression is that if we had evidence that suggested there was a possible violation of the obstruction statutes, we would continue to investigate it until we'd reached a conclusion.
And a lawyer for a subject can obstruct justice?
A lawyer for a subject can obstruct justice?
Subject of an investigation can obstruct justice in the investigation, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, my time's up. Thank you,
Senator Sass.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Horowitz, can you remind us who Cheryl Mills and Heather Samuelson are?
Ms. Mills was a counselor at the State Department during Secretary Clinton's tenure, and Ms. Samuelson was also in her front office.
And why do they show up in your report?
Well, for several reasons. On the one hand, after they left the State Department and Secretary Clinton left the State Department, they culled through Secretary Clinton's emails to decide which ones they concluded were work-related and which ones weren't. Then the ones they concluded were work-related were ultimately forwarded to the State Department, so they were involved in that process. In addition, they appear, as we describe here, at Secretary Clinton's interview on July 2nd, representing her as her lawyer.
So they have professional relationships in the government, professional relationships outside the government, compensated as lawyers, personal relationships and political relationships, and they're allowed to accompany Secretary Clinton to her interview. How can that be?
Well, we describe in here what the rationale that was given to us. As we lay out here, we think it was inconsistent with normal investigative procedure, and we're concerned about it.
Were they ultimately involved in expunging evidence and information that was criminal?
They were ultimately involved in instructing individuals to remove, destroy what they had concluded were non-work-related emails. I'll leave it to others to decide what that meant as a legal matter.
So were they ever a target of investigation themselves, Ms. Mills or Ms. Samuelson?
From our review here, what we were told was that the only individual considered for a potential charging decision was Secretary Clinton. As we noted here, actually nobody was listed as a subject of this investigation at any point in time.
Can you think of any other investigation that has no subject of the investigation?
I think you probably could have a circumstance. I'd leave it to Director Wray, although in this case where it was a focus, there was a focus of some idea of who was the individual or individuals that were involved in the events. That would be surprising, but again, I would defer to the Director.
Director Wray, can you give me an example of any investigation like this where people who are potentially involved in the destruction of criminal evidence would be allowed to accompany a supposed subject of an investigation but not named target subject of an investigation? Any example anywhere like that?
It's hard for me to come up with one. It's my experience, subjects don't usually accompany each other to interviews.
I asked Director Comey about this in a hearing in, I think, probably spring, summer of 2016 on the Homeland Security Committee. And he said that when you're trying to get information out of a witness who maybe, or a subject, I don't remember the term, the noun he actually used, but when you're trying to get information and you're trying to compel them, and it may take a long time if you have to subpoena them, you would do things like this. Can you think of any examples like that?
Well, again, I've already testified to my experience. I'm reluctant ever to speak in terms of something never, ever happening, because in my experience, there are very few absolutes in this world, but certainly the norm would be what I described.
It's truly bizarre. Mr. Horowitz, can you tell us about President Obama's comments on the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails in the spring and summer of 2016?
Yeah, there were several occasions when either President Obama or his press secretary made comments about the Clinton email investigation, and as we describe here, that raised concerns by both the investigative team and the Attorney General and the prosecutors. And as we also describe here, it's one of the reasons cited to us by Director Comey for his belief that he had to, in essence, go it alone and make the announcement he had to make that he made on July 5.
I think many of us on both sides of the aisle are concerned about the erosion of norms, about Article 2 officials commenting on ongoing investigations. I think it's a terrible thing in 2017 and 2018. I think it was a terrible thing in 2016. Can you tell us a little bit inside the culture of the Department of Justice? Was there a sense that the President of the United States commenting on an ongoing investigation was a problem? Did the Attorney General's office know that this was a problem?
It was a concern. We describe in here in detail what the reaction was, which was surprise and concern. And in fact, the Attorney General and the Justice Department reached out to the White House to find out how did this occur, why did it occur, and that it couldn't continue to occur.
And that's General Lynch, I assume, at that
That's
time?
correct.
And so General Lynch then would seemingly be a person who wants to guard the integrity of these norms, and yet she's meeting with the former President of the United States, the husband of someone being investigated, even if not named as a subject. And once she had crossed this line of having sat on the tarmac with President Clinton, what steps did she then take?
So at that point, she went to the department ethics officer for a ethics opinion on whether it required her to recuse, which, as you know, is one step, but there is two parts. There is the mandatory recusal, and the laws are very, I'll call narrow as to that. There's also the permissive recusal provisions, but she went and got an opinion as to whether she was required to recuse. She decided that she would not recuse on the permissive basis. And then publicly announced on July 1st what her role would be going forward. And as we describe here, we found it confusing and unclear what she was telling the public her role would ultimately be, because on the one hand, she was saying that she, following her normal practice, would hear the recommendations and fully intended to accept the recommendation. On the other hand, was saying she would accept the recommendation. So not clear what that meant, since there are potential conflicts between those two.
Not clear to the Bureau, not clear to the prosecutors who are supposed to be making these decisions, and not clear to the public and to the press.
Correct.
Shifting gears, I only have a little bit of time left. Director Wray, you've said you're going to institute new training about leaks inside the Bureau. Kudos, thank you. It's clearly necessary. Can you give the layman's summary on what individual FBI officials and FBI agents are allowed to talk to the press about, when and why?
It's hard to put it all in one thumbnail. Certainly there are things like got to stick within the charging documents, as we talked about before. Wouldn't talk about ongoing investigations publicly. But I think there are situations where we would talk about, an arrest that's been made, for example. You often see an SAC in a field office do a press conference together with partners announcing an arrest. So those are some of the kinds of situations. But the reason we've had a very specific, very detailed policy is to make sure that everybody understands what those rules are. And one of the things that's clear to me is that now, having put the new policy in place, we need to pound home the importance of following that policy. I want to be in a situation where everybody in our organization understands exactly what the rules are, so that A, the 99.9% of them that follow them, and B, the remaining percent, it's very easy to pursue an appropriate investigation and discipline if that's what's warranted.
The chairman's going to gavel me out, so let me just say, Director Wray, we're glad you're there. Your agency is incredibly important to the American people, and there's been a massive breach of public trust, and it needs to be restored, and I think there are a lot of people pulling for you in your calling.
Senator Arano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, you just testified just now that President Obama's comments about the Clinton investigation in 2015 caused you concern. So you must be very concerned about President Trump's ongoing comments about the current Mueller investigation including his thoughts about his pardon powers.
What I said was, as we laid out here, the comments of President Obama at the time were of concern to the people doing the investigating. So frankly, what we were looking at is what individuals told us. I'm not going to speak to what the reaction would be in the FBI or elsewhere with regard to current concerns. Frankly, the director can speak to that question better than I.
So, Director, do you have concerns about the President Trump's ongoing comments about the Mueller investigation, including his use of his pardon powers?
Senator, there are an awful lot of opinions being expressed out there on an awful lot of topics about our work. What I try to make sure our folks are focused on is the work itself and following the rules. And I will add that there's a reason why I always say that we are going to do our work independently and objectively, no matter who likes it.
Thank you. That's very reassuring. Unfortunately, these kinds of ongoing comments do sway the public. When Director Comey came before this committee on May 3rd and he was fired on May 9th, some of us on this committee, including myself, questioned why he made all those derogatory and highly prejudicial comments about Hillary at his press conference in July. So, Director Wray, I want to make sure, commenting publicly about unchargeable conduct is not FBI policy then or now, correct?
Senator, I'm not aware of any policy that permitted it at the time, but as I said, we're working on policies to make even more clear things that may have been less clear before.
Good, thank you. Mr. Horowitz, I'd like to follow up on your answer to Senator Graham about the difference between gross negligence and extremely careless. You said it was just a political difference, but that's not true. There's a legal difference. In fact, you spent a few pages of your report explaining the difference, and you made clear how unified your team was on its early decision, or the FBI team was on its early decision that there was no evidence that Senator Clinton intentionally or willfully mishandled classified information. And if she had, that would be what they would have considered gross negligence. So your answer to Senator Graham made it sound as if the determination that Senator Clinton did not have the requisite intent necessary for a criminal charge was a close call and a late call, but that was not the case. I'd like to give you a chance to correct that misimpression.
That certainly wasn't my intention in leaving that impression. I think the concern that we highlight here is that by drafting a statement where he said he believed there was gross negligence and turning it into extremely careless, was precisely the concern that many people commented on, which is people viewed it as close and roughly one and the same. I understand that the former has a legal meaning and the latter doesn't, but to the public at large, that was the concern that the prosecutors and others had about his comment.
I think it was really important for Director Comey to be very careful in the use of these kinds of terms. I mean, not to mention that he should never have editorialized in such a way to begin with. And really, the showing that needed to happen for any kind of criminal prosecution of Senator Clinton was that there had to be a requisite intent, and there was no requisite intent. So in my view, when Director Comey, even when he said extremely careless, I think that was being very careless on his part. I wanted to go on to something else that was brought out at this hearing. One of my colleagues said earlier that clearly Strzok did not want Donald Trump elected. If that is true, and this is for either one of you, if that is true, why do you think that he did not leak any information about the Trump-Russian investigation that was also ongoing during the time of the 2016 election? Care to comment?
The argument he made to us as to why there was evidence he wasn't biased is precisely that argument. I don't think that necessarily closes off the bias question simply because he didn't violate a rule regarding leaking, though.
Well, the fact is that the public did not know that there was an investigation over Russia's attempts to interfere with our elections or any of the Trump team's involvement with those Russian efforts. So reasonable people could conclude And, I conclude that the bottom line is that Russia and Comey helped to elect Trump. And Russia did its part by sowing discord among Americans, spreading lies about Hillary Clinton, and offering help to the Trump family and campaign at every turn. And Comey pitched in by keeping the FBI investigation into the Trump-Russia situation a secret, while publicly trashing Secretary Clinton in July and reopening the investigation in late October, even though Comey knew about the Weiner emails a full month before finally coming out with publicly that he was going to basically reopen the Clinton investigation. So as far as reasonable people could conclude, James Comey tipped the scales further in Trump's favor. Is there anything in your report that argues against this reasonable conclusion?
Senator, we don't go into the impact that had on the election. That's not something we would even have any ability or expertise to.
I'd say reasonable people could conclude that Russia and Comey helped to elect President Trump. And in fact, during the time of the election, candidate Trump, was very happy with what was going on with Comey, and in fact invited the Russians to engage in further efforts to go after Mrs. Clinton. So, I just want to know, there have been calls for a special counsel. This is for you, Mr. Horowitz. Should there be further investigations into what happened regarding the Clinton investigation?
As Inspector General, that's most clearly not my decision to make. And the last thing I'm going to do is step outside the authorities you've given me, the Congress, and the IG Act.
So you can't respond to that, Director Wray? Is there anything in this report that indicates that there should be another special counsel or further investigation of the Clinton matter?
Well, Senator, the decision about whether or not and when to appoint a special counsel is one that's reserved to the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General if the Attorney General is recused. And one of the key takeaways from this report is that the FBI director shouldn't, as Inspector General Horowitz just said, get out of his lane. So I'm going to rely on that.
So has Deputy Director Rosenstein said to you that you should begin an investigation into the Clinton matter?
Senator, I can't comment on my conversations with the Deputy Attorney General about investigations.
Thank you.
I've been told that one Republican and one Democrat is going to still come for their first round. And so Senator Kennedy said he had one question, and Senator Whitehouse said he had one question. Normally, I didn't want to have a second round because I thought the vote's coming up and would be close to the vote. So you go ahead, Senator Kennedy, with your one question, and Senator Whitehouse with his one question. And then if the others two don't show up, we're going to stop.
General Horowitz, I wanted to ask you about Assistant Attorney General Peter Kadzik. My understanding that Mr. Kadzik was an Assistant Attorney General. He attended all the senior staff meetings at Justice. At these senior staff meetings, the Attorney General was in attendance, and various investigations by the FBI were discussed. I also understand that Mr. Kadzik was a good friend of John Podesta. Mr. Podesta was President Obama's chief of staff, and he was chairman of the Hillary Clinton for President campaign, and that Mr. Kadzik also had worked for Governor Dukakis, Senator Walter Mondale, our Governor, Vice President Walter Mondale, and was involved in the Mark Rich pardon. Now, he asked the Clinton campaign for a job for his 24-year-old son. While that job request was pending, he sent Mr. Podesta a heads-up email about the release of Mrs. Clinton's emails. Is my understanding right?
It is.
Did you look at Mr. Kadzik's telecommunication devices to see if he had other communications with Mr. Podesta?
As I sit here, frankly, I don't recall. Let me get back to you on that.
Would you do that?
Absolutely.
Did you look at Mr. Podesta's telecommunication devices to see if he got other communications from Mr. Kadzik?
I don't believe we went to Mr. Podesta's communication devices as a third party.
Would you do that?
Let me talk with the team, and if I could get back to you on that.
Okay.
I'd appreciate
Well, my point, not to put too fine a point on it, but he already was giving inside information to the chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign. He did it once while his son's job request was pending. It would seem to me it'd be a reasonable possibility he did it other times as well. I'm not saying, I'm not alleging it. I just want to know.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, and thank you to our witnesses for your hard work and for what's been a long hearing. I want to begin by thanking you, Inspector General Horowitz, and your staff, the Director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, and the thousands of agents and DOJ professionals who are doing a difficult, sometimes even dangerous jobs to investigate and prosecute crimes all over the country. The IG and FBI have demonstrated something very important today through this process and through this report, which is that our country's most senior leaders, our most senior law enforcement leaders, are subject to scrutiny for their conduct. It bears repeating that for this review, senior IG staff conducted over 100 interviews and reviewed over 1.2 million documents, including interviews with a former president, former attorney general, former FBI director. Frankly, that's something that wouldn't happen in a lot of other countries, and it makes me proud to be an American and proud to continue to support the rule of law. In the United States, even the most senior